Tonight on KQED Newsroom, from affordable housing to fighting wildfires, Governor Gavin Newsom talks with us about tackling big and costly challenges ahead. Also, a flurry of IPO filings from Uber and other tech companies sparks a backlash. And a new United Nations report paints an alarming picture of how humans and climate change are accelerating the extinction of plants and animals. Hello and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. We begin with state politics. On Thursday, Governor Gavin Newsom released a revised state budget that's $4 billion higher than the one he unveiled in January. He wants to use some of those additional funds to address what he says is the state's, quote, affordability crisis, especially for working families. One proposal will extend up to 4 months the paid family leave for new parents. State lawmakers will review the budget and have until mid-June to send a final version to the governor that includes their plans to tackle costly challenges from housing to wildfire prevention. KQED senior editor of California Politics and Government, Scott Shafer, spoke earlier with Governor Newsom.
Governor Newsom, thanks for joining us.
Good to be here.
The budget you released at the state capitol is $4 billion or so larger than the one in January, money for fire prevention, homelessness, other things. Are there things you would have actually liked to include that you didn't, either because of lack of revenue or political pushback from the legislature or elsewhere?
I mean, obviously, we need to do a lot more on K through 12 public education investment, a lot more on teacher training, teacher retention, teacher pay, special education. That said, we put an historic amount of money into special education and teacher training. We put close to $700 million of new money for special ed, $150 million for teacher training, but it's still a modest amount considering the totality. Second, look, I'd love to move forward more expeditiously with universal health care. We have the capacity to do more than any other state. This budget reflects that, but obviously it's going to take a few more years to truly have the resources, which are in the multiple billions of dollars, to ultimately achieve that goal and ultimately advance the real goal, which is changing our financing to a single-payer financing framework.
On your housing proposal, you acknowledge that some of the critics say your goals are a little too audacious. Do you feel like you may have to scale that back a bit?
Our goals in housing have been pathetically modest, and we've reached some of them. The fact is we're producing less than 100,000 housing units a year. We need to be producing close to 300,000 to 400,000 to address the price imbalance or demand and price imbalance. That said, I want to be realistic, but at the same time I want to be audacious. So we'll amend them. We've got a regional strategy that we've laid out, $1.75 billion in the budget for housing. In that regional strategy is identifying new numbers, what we call RENA goals, and those numbers come in, we'll update our statewide goals.
You suggested in January the idea of tying gas tax revenue to local governments, tying that to their progress on housing construction. A lot of pushback on that, especially in places like Orange County. Some Democrats who are freshmen worried about getting recalled or not reelected. Right. Is that a lack of political courage, or what is that, do you think?
It's okay. I mean, look, it's carrots and sticks. We know, look, I had to sue Huntington Beach because they simply weren't in their, they weren't compliant with their what we call housing element. They just simply weren't even planning for new housing. It's one of the reasons we're 49th out of 50th in per capita housing units in this country. We're simply not building, and the state of California can't build. Localism's determinative. Local municipalities, counties, they're the ones creating the conditions for investment. We've got to enliven them, and we're putting up unprecedented amount of money to support them. But all I'm asking for on the back end, if you don't do your job, if you refuse to do it, how can we leverage that?
Is there a concern that if you did withhold the gas tax money that you might be foregoing worthwhile transportation projects?
No, we'd spend every penny. No one was suggesting we would spend 100%.
But I mean in those districts where it's withheld.
Yeah, the point is, though, there's a job housing linkage. There's a job transportation housing linkage. The fact is, you don't need new transit funds if you're not building more capacity for individuals to actually utilize the roads. Those that are producing housing, I think they should be rewarded, should be incentivized. Housing and transportation, to me, they're the same. And so just trying to find ways to link the two up, I think, is important.
State Senator Scott Wiener, as you know, is coming back again, this time with SB 50, to encourage more high-density housing, especially around job centers and transit hubs. A lot of pushback on that as well. It's already been amended to exclude, to a certain extent, counties like Sonoma, more rural counties. There also is concern at the local level about overreach, state overreach, and trying to dictate to the local governments. As a former mayor, now governor, is that concern legitimate?
Yeah, I think a concern is legitimate, but let me just express this. There's a bigger concern. That's the status quo. California dream is quite literally in peril. I listen to the folks on the far right criticize the state. In one respect, they're right. The middle class are getting squeezed. The haves and have-nots is manifesting a record number of homeless. People can't afford to live here. We got to get serious about our housing issues, and we just simply can't put up with the excuses and with respect, sometimes I'll say it, the NIMBYism that marks our politics, and we all have to row together. And so, look, I appreciate what Scott's trying to do, Senator Wiener. We'll see where that bill ends up and see if it even lands on my desk. But I really appreciate him inspiring a debate anew. And the state, you're right, shouldn't have to do this, but it's in the absence of real local leadership at scale that obviously forces our hand in Sacramento to try to do something novel, something different.
You've got money in the budget for additional wildfire prevention. There's a lot of talk in Sacramento about what to do with PG&E, how much liability they should be on the hook for. Some places like San Francisco are considering a public power grid. There's talk about breaking up PG&E. When you think about all this and you look down the road 2 to 5 years, what do you see PG&E looking like?
It's got to be a different company than it is today. Different leadership, different board, different culture. I mean, we've changed a lot of leadership, but the culture hasn't changed at PG&E. They got to get serious about safety. They got to be serious about investing in the future and their infrastructure, technology. They got to get serious about dealing with the immediate crisis, which is twofold. That's one, making whole the victims of the fires, to making sure they get the settlements moving forward to make those victims whole. They got to get serious about getting out of bankruptcy so they can make themselves whole and start investing in our low carbon green growth future. We're going to hold them to account. At the same time, we have a very challenging reality, and that is it's very difficult to operate a utility with the hots getting hotter and the dries getting drier. And you have 2 other major utilities in California that are 1 bond rating away from junk bond status themselves. And that's why we need a comprehensive strategy that's bigger than PG&E.
Question about police accountability. There are 2 competing bills in the legislature right now, one supported by police unions that calls for more training, another supported by the ACLU and other groups that calls for more accountability and sort of holding police officers accountable when there's deadly force and it's not just in self-defense. Where do you fall on that, on those 2 competing measures?
Let me answer it this way. Number one, it's important because it's relevant. Our budget reflects a record amount of money for training, police training, what we call our POST program. That's an important enhancement in the budget. Number 2, I'm trying to do my best to get the parties together. I've got a key staff member who's working, I don't think it's exaggerating, full-time, literally, on just this topic. There are good people of goodwill on all sides that are working, I think, collaboratively to see if it is possible to find some compromise.
There's also a dispute over whether a bill passed and signed last year on transparency and release of police personnel records is retroactive or not. The Attorney General, Javier Becerra, is taking the position, at least for now, that it is not retroactive. What is your position? Do you agree with where the Attorney General is right now, or would you like to see those personnel records released soon?
Deep respect for the Attorney General. He's a friend, and I don't just say that in political terms. He's a friend personally, and I have great respect and admiration for him from a policy and political perspective. We put out a memo. It contrasts a bit with the Attorney General's position. We believe the law allows for retroactivity.
All right. Governor Gavin Newsom, thank you so much for joining us.
Grateful. Thank you.
Now to the tech industry. Ride-hailing giant Uber went public on Friday, valued at nearly $80 billion. It's the biggest IPO of the year. Its main rival, Lyft, went IPO in March and posted a loss of more than $1 billion in its first earnings report as a public company. The IPO has come amid growing unrest among Uber and Lyft drivers who went on strike Wednesday over wages and labor practices. Also this week, Facebook co-founder Chris Hughes became the latest high-profile voice to call for breaking up or regulating the tech giant. Here now to discuss all of this are San Francisco Chronicle business columnist Kathleen Pender and senior editor Casey Newton from The Verge. Good to have both of you here.
Thank you.
Great to be
So
here.
let's start with Facebook co-founder Chris Hughes. His op-ed, he basically said Facebook has not only harmed democracy, but is now a monopoly. And he says that Mark Zuckerberg's power is, quote, unprecedented and un-American. So, Casey, how much weight do you think this will carry in the growing calls to break up Facebook, or are we really looking at a more likely scenario of regulations, but not a breakup?
Well, I think that regulation is more likely than a breakup. The antitrust enforcement in this country is just very weak right now. But what's interesting about Hughes's op-ed is that it puts him in an ever-lengthening line of early Facebook employees who are sounding the alarm about the company. And what's interesting is how consistent their message is. They say it's too large, it's too powerful, and the government needs to step in. So Hughes isn't the first person to say this, but he is a co-founder of the company. And while people inside of Facebook tend to discount his views for a bunch of reasons, I think that his voice is carrying pretty widely today.
And not just Facebook former employees, but Roger McNamee, an early Facebook investor, has been out basically saying the same message. But does a breakup make sense, Kathleen?
Well, I was kind of surprised that Hughes never brought up the point. And another alternative to breaking them up or antitrust regulation would just be for Congress to outlaw the super voting majority shares that lets Zuckerberg control about 60% of the company, even though he sold most of it to the public. A lot of tech companies, media companies are using this share structure where the owners can still get over 50% control of the company, even though they don't own much of the stock.
So they're the boss. They don't have to answer to anybody, not even the shareholders.
That's what gives him that kind of control.
That's true. I would also say, though, that I don't know that there's any one person who can manage a network of more than 2 billion people, right? And that's a point that Hughes makes in his op-ed, is it's hard to think of a person who you would want to entrust with all of that power. I agree with Kathleen. I think it would be great if there was more accountability on all boards at public companies. But I do think that at Facebook, the problems might be larger than just that.
Okay, let's move on to the other big tech story of this week, and that is the Uber IPO. Kathleen, Uber went public this morning at a stock price of $45, but by the end of the day, it fell nearly 8% to about $41.50. What does this tell you? It's rather disappointing for a really highly anticipated IPO.
Well, it was a volatile day on the market altogether. The Dow was down big most of the day, although it managed to close up. The Uber never went above its IPO price. I think the big thing that's happening is that, obviously Lyft went public and is trading way below its price. That didn't bode well for Uber. And also, investors are just somewhat pessimistic about the path toward profitability for these companies. There is a path, but it's long and winding and full of hills, I think.
Yeah, I think it's actually a story about the market working. Like, if you read the S1 for Uber, they said we're going to lose $1.8 billion over the next year. And I think the public took a look at that and said, what exactly are we buying a piece of here, right? The company wants to tell you that, well, Uber Eats will make money, or we'll make money with micro-mobility, these, scooters and other things like that. But, right now, Uber is just a very challenged-looking business, and its growth is slowing.
And there are lots of questions about how much longer it can continue to classify its workers as independent contractors and not employees. And in fact, Kathleen, this week, Lyft and Uber drivers went on a one-day strike. They were protesting their pay, their working conditions. And you had an article today in the Chronicle about how much drivers actually get paid. How does that work? How much do they make?
Well, the story was more about the discrepancy between what the passenger pays and what the driver makes. And that difference is Uber and Lyft's profit. And it varies a lot. It's all over the map, no pun intended. But that's because the drivers get paid primarily on time and distance, but passengers get charged kind of whatever the market will bear. So the profit that goes to Uber can be anywhere from very little to 50 or 60% of the fare.
And so the drivers, the money they make can be decent or very little.
Well, what they make also depends a lot on how often they work, where they work, when they work, etc.
And Casey, the Labor Department, on that issue of independent contractors, the Labor Department recently issued a letter that pretty much allows Uber and Lyft and other so-called gig economy companies to keep classifying workers as independent contractors and not employees. In these cases, though, could public opinion make a difference? Because we saw Instacart, the huge uproar about tipping theft, and Instacart changed its policies.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think the Uber case is a little bit different from the Instacart one, though, just because a lot of Uber drivers like being independent contractors, right? There are a lot of Uber drivers out there who don't want to have it as a full-time job. They love just being able to turn it on for a few hours over the weekend and make a few extra bucks. So I think it's actually really hard to figure out how you would devise the perfect solution, given that some drivers want to be employees and some don't.
And also, speaking of public opinion, you know, there's a tech backlash happening in San Francisco. Supervisor Gordon Marr is suggesting a higher IPO tax to raise millions for housing and education and other causes. Is this reflective, do you think, of a broader public opinion shift going from New York to San Francisco, of officials and the public wanting to hold tech companies more accountable for gentrification and things like income inequality?
Well, I think like the shift that is going on is that tech companies are big and rich now. And so if you're a supervisor and you want money, they're the obvious place to look. And, you know, I support like many of the taxes in this city, but to me, the idea that you would tax IPOs, which are a very rare event, very unpredictable, as a way of solving our hardest problems, that seems crazy to me. Like, we know how to solve the housing crisis, and it's to build more housing. So I'd like to hear, you know, Supervisor Marr's plan for that.
It wasn't that long ago that the city was passing tax breaks for tech companies
the so-called Twitter tax break.
To move them to mid-market. That was not that long ago, and we've kind of gone full circle on that.
And speaking of IPOs, there are going to be lots of instant millionaires. What impact will that have on Bay Area housing prices?
Well, that's a big topic in real estate markets, and you're seeing a lot of all kinds of estimates about what all these IPOs are going to do to the housing market. I think Redfin put out a study that said current and former Uber employees with their IPO riches could buy all of the homes that are on the market right now in San Francisco, Oakland, and Berkeley. And the city's chief economist, Ted Egan, has estimated that the IPOs could raise the median home price by anywhere from like $7,000 to $25,000. But honestly, we don't know. We don't know how many of those employees have stock, how many are going to buy a house, how many are going to take that money and move to a low tax or no tax state. Also, you have to look at what's going on in the market in general now, and the real estate market is just not as vibrant as it was last year. I think the median home price in the Bay Area dipped for the first time in a bunch of years last month. So maybe what you'll see is instead of prices going up, maybe they won't go down as much as they would have, or maybe they will soar. It'll be interesting to see.
A lot of variables to watch. Kathleen Pender with the San Francisco Chronicle and Casey Newton of The Verge. Thank you both.
Thank you.
We turn our attention now to climate change. This week, a United Nations report warns that as many as 1 million plant and animal species are at risk of extinction, largely due to human actions and global warming. The global assessment involved thousands of scientific studies and hundreds of international experts. It lays out clear links between biodiversity and human well-being, including food security and clean water. We talk more about this with Dan Kamen, an energy professor with UC Berkeley, and Tom Steyer, a philanthropist and environmental activist who is the founder and president of the political action committee Next Gen America. Nice to have both of you here. We will get to climate change in just a moment, but Tom, I know that you have been loudly lobbying for the impeachment of President Trump. This week there was the president's assertion of executive privilege over the Mueller report. There was also the House committee vote to hold Attorney General Barr in contempt of Congress. But Democratic leaders are still sidestepping the issue of impeachment. So what do you think it will take to change their minds?
Well, I think that, as Speaker Pelosi said, we're in a constitutional crisis because this president has, in an almost blanket fashion, said he will not submit to oversight from Congress, that he does not recognize the separation of powers, and he is in effect at war with an equal branch of government. So I believe that we are in a crisis, and that crisis will only deepen as the Congress people try to decide how to assert their power, and the president is intransigent in insisting that he is subject to no power, whether it's the courts or the Congress.
But yet Speaker Pelosi is not willing to start impeachment hearings. Do you think she's making a mistake? And what do you think it will take for her to change her mind?
Well, I think the facts. I think the facts are going to overtake her. I've always felt that if you don't think that there's enough information yet to impeach him, wait till tomorrow. And I think tomorrow's here, and she's being overtaken by the fact that this president has said that her branch of government doesn't exist as far as he's concerned.
All right, let's move on to climate change because we want to talk about that as well. And Dan, the new United Nations report goes further than previous studies about the Earth's ecosystem. It details really how closely our fate, the fate of humans, is intertwined with the fate of other species. Can you give us a good couple of examples of that?
Well, really, this push to understand the extinction revolution as a part of our energy and biodiversity future is really here. And we see it in honeybees and the incredible decline in their numbers, the impact on our food security. And we also see it on the incredibly small and fragile remaining patches of nature, where we now see the value of biodiversity for pollination, but also for fish stocks, for a whole variety of features. And the UN is really highlighting this is not a single trick pony. It's not just energy, it's got to be clean, but we have to preserve the planet we're going to live on too.
So, is there a way to stop this decline of biodiversity at this point, or is the best that we can hope for really just damage control?
No, we can do much more than damage control. We've seen from wildlife corridors in Africa to helping fish to get up fish ladders and spawning to setting aside biodiverse strips around farming and other areas. We can really bring the system back, but we have to commit to understanding that we're part of nature. Nature's not a part of us.
And Tom, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warns that we really only have about 10 years left before we can avert catastrophic climate change. So polls, though, at the same time show that many Americans don't view this as their top priority. So what do you think it will take for them to make it a top priority?
Well, one thing that has changed, Twee, is that for Democratic primary voters, this actually is the #1 issue. So that I think we've seen a real change, and the vast majority of Americans, including the majority of Republicans, understand that we need clean energy and that we need to act on it. But what we have is an absolute system failure here, where the donors from the fossil fuel community are controlling the Republican Party, and they're refusing to accept the idea that Dan and other scientists know something about science, and they're insisting on making short-term money regardless if it kills everybody on the planet.
So how do we address that, Dan, if that's the case?
Well, I think there's a couple angles. One is that, as Tom said, this is at the top of the agenda now, and we have presidential candidates that are highlighting 100% clean energy agendas, and they're finding the more they dig in, 100% clean energy also means more jobs. It means better opportunities for low-income Americans, and so there is a real nexus around clean, sustainable, and progressive. And that message is one that can push beyond simply the environmental wings of the parties.
And speaking of the technologies that we're seeing, because it isn't all bad news, right? Clean energy technologies getting better, getting cheaper.
It's not only not all bad news, it's good news.
So what are some of the 2 or 3 bright spots that you see right now in terms of progress on fighting climate change?
Well, there are a couple different ways to answer that question. The first one, if you're asking about technology, is you can see that renewable energy generation is the cheapest energy generation that there is. Wind generation and solar are cheaper than fossil fuels, including natural gas. So when people say, well, we're going to have to give something up in order to go renewable, the answer is, no, you're not. You're going to have to give something up in order to pollute, which is crazy. And the other thing I'd say is this, which is amazing to me. The Nevada State House voted for a proposition that we put forward on the ballot last year, which is 50% renewable energy, clean energy, by 2030. And every Republican voted for it. Every Republican in both the state Senate and the state legislature voted for 50% clean energy by 2030. I was shocked, but maybe we're seeing a revolution on both sides of the aisle.
Dan, what about nuclear power, though? Well, is that a feasible option?
It's feasible, but it's in a tricky spot because nuclear right now is so much more expensive than renewables that Tom is mentioning. And as energy storage becomes not only cheap, but also legislature after legislature, California and now New York and now Arizona, are all picking energy storage over natural gas. So nuclear is going to have to get safer and cheaper and easier to install. And I'm a professor of nuclear engineering. I would love to see it succeed, but it doesn't match the clean energy market today.
Okay. And on the political front, we have now progressive Democrats proposing a Green New Deal, calling for a government-led program to invest in clean energy and create new jobs. What do you think of that?
It's fantastic. Look, do I agree with everything that they proposed? No. But what they did is they came in with a huge proposal for a huge problem. And so it's a first draft, and everyone else who has a better idea, fine. Come in with an improvement from the Green New Deal. But for people who sit on the sidelines and pollute and then sharpshoot people who are going out and trying to solve the problem, I say, listen, I'm not going to give you a single word until you stop polluting and come in with an actual suggestion that's workable. They came in with an actual suggestion that's workable.
And I think what's exciting about the Green New Deal also is that it really takes the environmental movement to be an environmental plus social movement. We're seeing direct outreach to low-income communities, understanding how electric vehicles can serve people who can't necessarily afford to buy a new car, how clean energy can stabilize prices, and moving the environmental movement, as critical it is, to be environmental plus social. That's really what we have been hoping and waiting to see. And the number of youth that are really taking a lead role, from the Thunbergs in Europe to school strikes in the United States, we are seeing something that business leaders, politicians have to take advantage and have to listen to.
If you watch how it's worked in California, and we do have the most progressive energy legislation in the world, it's been led by legislators from the poorest districts in California. Led. They didn't go along with it. You go and look and see who actually did the redo of the cap and trade system. People from the poorest districts, because they knew that the air pollution was hurting their constituents and the kids in their districts.
The environmental justice movement.
It's
growing.
That's what should be leading here. Right. Dan's exactly right. We should be leading with justice, knowing that if we do that, we'll get the right policy for climate and justice.
What do you think about, Beto O'Rourke and Jay Inslee, the presidential candidates? They've come forth with their own climate change proposals as well, and they seem to be moving away from cap and trade programs and focusing on the carbon tax, and really thinking more in terms of the framework of electric cars and new technologies. Is that a better approach?
Well, I don't know if it's better, and I know those plans quite well. In fact, I would say they're not moving away from it. What they're recognizing is what California is doing, which is what Tom is saying, is that we have a carbon price, but you have to be pushing ahead on all fronts. We need to protect biodiversity, protect and make this an income generating for low-income people, and this is much more holistic than focusing just on the cap and trade.
All right, I will have to leave it there. Dan Kamen with UC Berkeley, and also Tom Steyer. Pleasure to have you both on.
Twee, thank you.
Thank you.
And that will do it for us. As always, you can find more of our coverage at kqed.org/newsroom. I'm Twee Vu. Thank you for joining us.